the Rambam uses the term derech hayeshara, the straight narrow path. That's where we should all be, on the straight narrow path. I'd once mentioned that when you say the Shema, the Talmud refers to it as Kabbalas Omal Shamayim. You accept the yoke of heaven upon yourself. So, as I mentioned in the past, yoke has a very heavy connotation. You visualize an ox with 2 blocks of wood on its shoulders, and its head is wedged in between the 2 blocks, that the animal can't turn its head in either direction. It can only look forward. That's what it means to accept the yoke of heaven. Seems to be really a hefty obligation, not simple. So Chaim Volozhin explains, if you understand what it means, it's pretty simple. You know, life is complicated. Sometimes life is complicated because we complicate it ourselves. If you would see initially and stick to the program, you wouldn't go off track. But unfortunately, we don't stick to the program. We believe we can do it better or differently. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. You have the wheel, just turn the wheel the way you're supposed to turn the wheel. Well, I'm going to put it in reverse and I'm going to go forward. It doesn't work that way. God created certain systems. You follow those systems, you don't get off track. You maintain clarity. You don't make mistakes. Nobody's perfect, but the mistakes are mistakes, which are they're just bumps in the road. Nothing worse than that. But if you go and you ignore the narrative and you write your own narrative, then we're talking about something else. You end up on a different planet. It's like, years ago, we used to get triptychs from AAA if you wanted to go somewhere. And the person who sent you the triptych, he thought you wanted to go north, and he sent you the triptych to go south. And there was a printing that said north, and you follow the triptych. Instead of ending up in Boston, you end up in Virginia. You go in the opposite direction. Very often we write our own triptych. We write our own ticket. But the ticket we write is not going to be the ticket that's going to get us through that front door. It's not going to allow us to arrive where we're supposed to arrive. And life is complicated as it is. You have to cut through all the smoke and all the fog and all the smog to be able to see what's beyond that, to see what's beyond the forest, to be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. That's how complicated life is. So how do you get as close as you can to that? You walk the straight and narrow path. Don't get distracted. A yoke, what it does for the ox, it doesn't allow it to turn its head as much as an iota in either direction. And its eyes are directed directly in front of it. It can't look off to the side. As a result of that, when it pulls that plow, the blade tears the ground in a straight line. But if that ox would veer to the right or the left, what happens to that blade that's a foot embedded in the ground? It breaks. And that's exactly what it is. Omal Shemai means, if you understand who God is, that he's the omnipotent one. He's the Almighty. And you're here in this world at his good graces. That's why we're here. And he's the underwriter. And he's the endower. And all we have to do is just follow his lead, so to say. There's no problem. But that's only if you don't get distracted. We all have egos. We know what drives a person is acknowledgement. We all want acknowledgement. So very often we'll do things that go beyond what we should be doing because we want to be acknowledged. But what you do to be acknowledged may be something which is not appropriate, or maybe a distraction. Could you imagine a person is a gambler. He has addiction for gambling. And he's a pilot on F-28. And he has to place a bet with his bookie on 42nd Street and wherever it may be, where the bookie has his place. and he takes out time to place the bet where the plane is going 1,500 miles an hour. You understand? You take your eyes off those controls over the computer system for more than 3 seconds, you can be at the end of the world. And you go into a mountain. You can't get distracted. Derech Yashar means there's no distraction. You're on that narrow and straight path. But we all have predilections. We have inclinations. We're being pulled in every direction. Because I have an insatiable appetite for material. I have a self-centered ego. I need that acknowledgement. I'm stoic. I don't value what I should be doing sufficiently to keep focused on it. So you have to somehow get to that equidistant point. That equidistant point between both extremes, that's the straight and narrow path. And to keep your eye on the ball, as we say. You got to keep your eye on that ball. You keep your eye on the ball, you don't go wrong. You get distracted, you never know where you end up in. You end up in a ditch, you go off the cliff. That's what life is all about. So now the Rambam is going to explain to us, how do you get to that equidistant point? How do you get on that straight and narrow path? Because when we start, we're far from that. Because we're all born, as he said, with various predilections, tendencies, characteristics. Whether we inborn, acquired them, developed them, but we have to overcome them. Breaking bad habits is not simple. It became habitual because we've been dealing with this for too long. The Chavetz Chaim writes that a person's raised and you speak always your mind because you feel you could say anything you want. And your parents never reined in on you. And they always allowed you to speak your mind. Whether it was critical, whether it had constructive value, didn't have constructive value. All of a sudden now at the age of 25, you realize, you open up the Torah and it says, 14 positive commandments, 17 negative commandments. You can be in violation if you're not careful what comes out of your mouth. So you understand the seriousness, but you realize, but you're already addicted and habituated to say whatever comes to your mind. That means all of a sudden you have to rein in on yourself. And until now, I wasn't sensitive to what came out of my mouth. Now all of a sudden, every word that I come out, even the connotation, the sound, the way I express it has a bearing on the way it's going to be received, whether it's going to be praiseworthy or it's going to be a sarcastic remark. So he says, who's at fault? The Chavetz Chaim writes, the parents. And the parents, as a young child, would have disciplined that child when they heard something negative. They would have reprimanded the child as a child has to be reprimanded or disciplined. That means that child would have never been allowed to go off that straight and narrow path. And even he would have slightly. But once you become an adult and you've been doing it for years, and now you have to retrace and go back and retake your life, it's not so simple. It's like pushing a boulder up a mountain. The person understands he has to stay away from certain foods because of the carbohydrate content, because of the cholesterol content, many reasons. But he's been eating this way for 40 years. As they used to say, people dig their graves with their fork and spoon. Literally. And the person understands it. He understands he has to take control. But how do you break a bad habit? It's an addiction. Eating is an addiction. It's not addiction like a drug addiction. Because if you have enough willpower, you can take control. A drug addiction is a whole different level. But it's an upheaval of your life. You need tremendous amount of strength and understanding and coaching and encouragement to be able to do it. What was the whole idea of Weight Watchers? Right? They would go once or twice a week. First thing you had to do, you had to pay the fee. Then they sold you a little scale. And then they gave you that book. And then they gave you the psychology. Then you go for group sessions and meet with other women who are in the same boat. You had to have a big boat in those days to fit them all in one boat. It wasn't simple. Okay? And the wife would come home and say to her husband, you can't imagine the value. Although it costs me $3 each time I go, it's worth it because I'm eating less food. Although I'm paying the fee every time I go. So it's not really impacting our budget. That's what the wife would tell the husband. Between the mahjong games. That's what she would tell him. Okay? But again, psychologically, you have to deal with the person psychologically. It's a whole psychological approach. It's not simple. That, to change your behavior, it's literally an upheaval. It's pushing a boulder up a mountain. And it keeps falling back. And you get crushed. You make 2 steps forward, you go 3 steps backwards. But over time, if you do it enough, as the Rambam will explain, you can recondition your life. If you could do it often enough and extreme enough to go literally the opposite direction, you'll be able to take control of your life. He gives an example. A person is naturally self-centered, pompous. You ever see people that come into a shul and they head straight for the front row? They don't ask, maybe they're sitting in somebody's seat, right to the front row, right before the rabbi. And they have the audacity that during services they talk. You want to talk, at least sit in the back row. No, I'm sitting in the front row and I'll behave the way I normally behave. And the person doesn't even realize how unacceptable his behavior is because he's so addicted and he only sees himself. He sees nobody else but himself. That's why he behaves this way. And then afterwards, he gets a redressing and says, you know something? Your behavior is literally shameful, embarrassment. It's embarrassment to all of us. And he realizes he has to somehow rein in on his ego. So Rambam says, you know what you do? You come into a location and you become anonymous. You sit in the back seat, the last seat in the shul, where maybe the beggars sit, where those people aren't even looked upon. You sit there. It's going to be painful for a while. Because here you want to be acknowledged and you're sitting with all these other people who are have-nots, and you're biting your tongue. And you're literally stewing in your brew over there. But if you'll do it long enough, eventually it's not going to be so painful. And you get used to it. And you begin realizing, what's it all about? You know, King Solomon says in Proverbs, a person who has a lot of money, everybody surrounds him and is busy with him. The moment, God forbid, you lose your wealth, you become a have-not. Nobody knows you. Person, what happened? When I had my money, everybody wants to consult with me. They want to acknowledge me and pay attention to me. Now I've lost my money. Why all of a sudden have I become persona non grata? I'm not worthy. I thought I was such a smart person. As they used to say, wake up and die right. It's not you. It's they want to be associated with your money because you're a rich man. Because you have what to offer them. But if you have nothing to offer, nobody wants to know you. And that's the reality. So again, but even though we put things in perspective, unless you go through the motion of reconditioning, we're all creatures of habit. Being a creature of habit, you got to break that habit. And that's how you get to the straight and narrow path. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You know, I studied with certain people, and it's amazing. Certain people are very successful. They have a phenomenal power of concentration. Phenomenal power of concentration. And when they read something and they're looking at it, they could sit there for 40 minutes and you walk into their room, into their office, and you're standing next to them by the desk and they don't even realize you're standing there. That's how immersed they are in reading what they're reading. You know what level of training you need for that? To be able to be so focused that nothing distracts you. You see nothing to the side or left of you. That's called being signally focused. You appreciate, you understand the information differently. You don't let anything distract you. So if you live your life in that manner, because you value whatever you want to value, and you have that level of focus, then you're advancing in life. But if every moment you're distracted, because you don't have that focus, so where do you fall back? You fall back to your habits. The way you conditioned your whole life up to that point. It's interesting. One area we don't have control over. What's that area? Let's say a person knows he has to put on tefillin. You have to observe Shabbos. All that. You could force yourself to give charity. You put money in the box. As much as you don't want to put the money, you put it in the box. What about you say the Amidah? And you're supposed to experience as if you're having an audience with God. And you're talking to him. And all of a sudden, your mind starts wandering. All of a sudden, thoughts come to mind. How do you control your mind? It's not so simple to control your mind. Your behavior, physically, you can rein in on yourself, or you could motivate yourself and force yourself to do things. The mind is the most difficult thing to control. You need tremendous amount of training. That when you get involved, the mind continuously is focused on whatever you're doing at that moment. Other thoughts don't filter in and disrupt it. Most people, it's almost an impossibility. It takes a degree of training, but it's more than training. It's trained together with levels of realization of who you're speaking to. Give you an example. Person, when he says the Amid, his mind wanders, thinks about everything. You know, he does a review of his whole life when he says that. For that 3 minutes that he says the Amid, his whole life he reviewed. But yet, when you have that important business meeting, the one that you wanted to meet, it took you 3 months to get that appointment. When you speak to him, nothing filters into your mind except that business meeting to be advised and talk to this particular person, that you're waiting to have those few moments with him. Why? You know why? Because that's so important. It's what you value. If that becomes your reality, the mind doesn't wander. If it's not key and core to your reality, everything filters in. And you're distracted, disrupted, and you can't have that focus. That's the reality. We had spoken, Avram, he was 137 years old. He was told to take his son, who was born to him in his old age, to bring him as a burnt offering. Avram, 137, even though he lived till 175, 137 is advanced in age. He was a very wealthy man. And yet, he rises early in the morning, hitches his own donkey. He had slaves, he had servants. Don't you think they would have been honored to hitch a donkey for him? Why did he hitch his own donkey? So Chazal tell us, the Midrash tells us, because Ava Mekalkelis is Ashura. Because when it comes to intense love, it overrides all protocol. Meaning, when Avram had to address that objective, the will of God, his love for God was all-consuming, that at that moment, there was no man who was 137 years old. There was no wealthy man. All that existed at that moment was to do the will of God. So he didn't think about himself. In his mind, it was only the objective. But that was his love. The love negated everything, suppressed everything, and all that's there is this. So what do? And it literally, you have fire in the belly. I have to do it. What about servants? I don't even think about servants. It has to be done. So what do? You hit your own donkey. Even though he's 137 years old, he has all this, he has stables of servants and slaves. Doesn't make a difference. Same idea. And the more advanced you are in reverence of Hashem and love of God, the easier it becomes, because everything else is minutia compared to that. If it's minutia, like Larry said, gibberish, it's less than gibberish. I wouldn't waste my time. I'll tell you a story. I'm not going to